Welcome to another edition of the Backyard Professor podcasts, or videos, I mean. I get so mixed up between podcasts and videos. I do a lot of both. I'm discussing this argument by the critics that the Book of Mormon has nothing going for it, that it reflects no genuine ancient cultures anywhere, that it's just simply a modern production of Joseph Smith's fantasy and imagination. Hugh Nibley, in the Prophetic Book of Mormon, various articles assembled of his. In his article, The Book of Mormon 40 Years After, page 539, he has something interesting to say about the waters of Sebus mentioned by Alma. The whole affair strikes anyone as very strange, he says. Alma 17:26, all the Lamanites would drive their flocks to a particular watering place, and when they got there, a certain number of Lamanites would scatter the king's flocks. Then the others would lament. They would cry and say, oh man, now the king's going to slay us. But Alma records that it's a regular practice. But yet the servants complain that the king's going to slay them. Nibley asks a really good question. What kind of insanity is this? What insanity that the king kills his own servants for losing a contest that had been acted out before? In fact, it was the practice of the Lamanites to stand by the waters of Sebus and scatter the flocks. They did this all the time, keeping what they took for themselves. Alma 18, verse 7. It wasn't a secret to anyone. Everyone knew about it, and yet it continued on. Didn't the king have enough men to protect his flocks if this event regularly happened? That's kind of odd, isn't it? Well, for one thing, the Lamanites played the game for sport. It was more than meat that they were after, for they delighted in the destruction of their brethren. And for this cause they stood to scatter the flocks of the king. Alma 17:35. The fun of it was their main interest, but Ammon spoiled the fun when he brought out his sling and started slaying them with his sling. And then when they came at him with their ceremonial clubs, he used his sword. Now there's only one way to work with a club. You have to lift your arm to smite the person. With a sword, when they lifted the arm, Ammon simply smote their arms off. And he contended with them. He took full advantage of the situation, and then he took the arms of the people back to the king. After that, the winning party brought the trophies to the king, he says, bearing the arms which had been smitten off by the sword of Ammon. Alma 17:39. By now it should be clear that we're dealing with some sort of a game, he says. A regular practice following certain rules. This becomes apparent when a few days later, the very men who had stood at the waters of Sebus and scattered the flocks, this is Alma 19:21, notice the progression of the story here, they mingled freely and openly with the crowd of people gathered at the palace at the report of the strange going on there. Some in the crowd said these things were happening because the king slew his servants who had their flocks scattered at the waters of Sebus. Alma 19:20. And the very men who had scattered the king's flocks loudly announced their presence by shouting abuses at Ammon for what he had done at the waters of Sebus. That's Alma 19:22. In fact, the brother of the man who Ammon slew, the leader, and it specifically says that, he came at Ammon with the sword. So it shows they had swords, so why weren't they using the swords at the waters of Sebus? All they used was that ceremonial club. Ammon had the sword. It's odd. Isn't it odd that those same wicked Lamanites walked around right in front of the king's palace where everybody recognized them and nobody did anything about it? And no one held it against the winning team that they had stolen their flocks back? The reason the losers were angry with Ammon was because he had thrown rocks and used his sword against men bearing only ceremonial clubs. All of this reminds us of those many ceremonial games in which the loser also loses his life, beginning with an Aztec duel, in which one of the contestants was tethered by the ankle and bore only a wooden mace, while his heavily armored opponent wielded a sword with sharp obsidian edges. The bloody fun of the famous basketball games played in the great ball courts in the ceremonial centers of Mesoamerica In these games, either the captain of the losing team or the whole team lost their heads. This is precisely what happened at the waters of Sebus with Ammon, isn't it? The thing I love about Hugh Nibley's analysis and research is that he was very careful with the details in the Book of Mormon. He read it so carefully, and he understood it in its fullest ramification and contexts. This waters of Sebus, this really odd, strange situation in the Book of Mormon, reflects Mesoamerican practices. I think that is utterly fascinating, absolutely intriguing and interesting. This argument that the Book of Mormon has no archaeological proof, has no historical context, has no cultural parallels to anything in antiquity, that there's absolutely nothing in its favor. This argument against the Book of Mormon is simply false.